Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 92nd Street Y for this virtual conversation. I'm Lucas Whitman, the Executive Director of the Unterberg Center for Poetry and Literature, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all this evening for a conversation with the great biographer, Richard Holmes. We're here to talk about his brilliant new book, right here. It just came out a few weeks ago in the US, called The Boundless Deep, Young Tennyson, Science, and the Crisis of Belief. It's an extraordinary um, excavation of one of the great Victorian figures, but you see him in an entirely new light thanks to Richard's brilliant and intrepid biographical study. Richard, of course, is one of the great biographers of our time. He's written brilliantly about Shelley and Coleridge, about in the Age of Wonder, about the birth of science and the Romantic era. He is, I think, also a brilliant uh, explicator of how we go about writing biography and his own process in books like Footsteps and Sidetracks. So I'm so thrilled to be speaking with him again. I should just add, Richard and I have met quite a few times, and we did a wonderful, in-depth conversation about his art and practice of biography for the Paris Review in 2017. And we'll include a link to that in the show notes. So thank you all for joining us, and I very much hope you enjoyed the conversation. Welcome, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi there.
And
Nice to
Richard's
be
joining
here.
us from England, from I think rainy spring England, right?
That's right. And I'm wondering what Tennyson would have made of Zoom. I think he might have rather liked it. He could have recited over it. I remember when he first came in touch with the big telephone lines that they were beginning to put up there in the 1850s and so on. And he stood beneath the telegraph wires and listened to the wind. And then he said, "This is the sound of the souls wailing."
Incredible.
And I think he would have thought something similar about Zoom, but living souls wailing.
Living souls. And
Yes.
now we have AI, which is even more terrifying kind of living soul here.
He
Well,
was, he
good. Well,
wasn't,
go ahead, Richard.
no, I was just going to say quickly, he wasn't frightened by technology and things like that. The wonderful account of the first time he rode on a railway train. Very interesting when he
Mm,
compared it to flying, but he was also fascinated by the idea of the lines ahead gradually
mm,
going like a sort of Renaissance picture coming through.
mm.
He loved that idea, and he used the trains a lot.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So I guess, I mean, one of the first question I had, and having obviously read a lot of your other work, is what drew you to Tennyson?
Yeah,
Why did you want to write about him?
and it's quite a complicated number of things. Starting off in London, I lived near Hampstead Heath, which is where Coleridge, my old subject, used to walk a lot in his mature years. And one famous day in April 1819, he met the very young Keats, John Keats, walking. And Coleridge held forth, as he was tried to do, a complete monologue. But Keats remembered the various subjects that he mentioned. And
Mm,
if I can remember the list, nightingales, monsters, poetical sensations, first and second consciousness. Only Coleridge
mm,
would about that.
only.
But the last of the list was the Kraken. And once I heard that, this took me, I thought, surely there's a Tennyson poem. And there is a short poem, a 15-line sonnet called The Kraken, which was a complete surprise once I'd found it. And it sort of opened the door because the Kraken is a semi-mythological, but also a properly defined underwater creature who comes up and bursts from the depths and
Mm,
bursts upon the surface. And that idea of the extinct creature, possibly extinct, coming up to the surface and bursting forth became a sort of key to the book. The Kraken could be read if you want. It's
yes,
quite
with pleasure. With
good.
pleasure.
So, um,
I think
it's
it sets it sets the metaphor for the whole
Yes,
study.
yes. The image of the Kraken, the thing coming out of the sea, and we'll mention the sea more in a moment, because that's very important. But here's this, and this poem he wrote was probably about 20, and he's first gone to Cambridge. And we'll talk about how Cambridge was a sort of great escape for him, I think, from a very unhappy family life. Here's the Kraken poem. Below the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath the abysmal sea, is ancient, dreamless, uninvaded sleep, the Kraken sleepeth. Faintest sunlights flee about his shadowy sides. Above him swell huge sponges of millennial growth and height, and far away into the sickly light from many a wondrous grot and secret cell, unnumbered and enormous polypi winnow with giant arms the slumbering green. There hath he lain for ages, and will lie battening upon huge sea worms in his sleep, until the latter fire shall heat the deep. Then once by man and angels to be seen, in roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. So that image,
Extraordinary.
extraordinary poem, again, probably only 20 when he wrote it. And that idea of monsters of the deep coming up becomes a shaping thing for the whole book. But
Mm.
both the kind of kraken of various kinds of scientific knowledge, which we'll talk about, but also an inner kraken that he had to struggle with, I think, with his what he called the Tennysons had black blood. They were black blooded
Mm.
and a
Mm.
kind of depression that is very close to, I think, his the poetical inspiration that kept him going, kept him so aware of everything. Anyway, that's the
Mm.
Kraken. So that's one link. Um, there's another
Brilliant.
one which goes in a very different way. Is the sea from which the Kraken emerges is also the wild North Sea in England, which is along
Hmm.
paradoxically the eastern coast, which is a very wild part of England. And he grew up there in Lincolnshire in a little village called Somersby. And it was a few miles from the wild beach at Maplethorpe. And
Hmm.
as a child, he used to walk along that beach. And as it were, the poems sort of came rising out of the sea to him.
Mm.
And
Mm.
as a kid, I cycled up from the south of England, at aged about 12, I think. Took me 3 days,
Mm.
from Kent up to that eastern coast and camped on the dunes above it. And this became a sort of, can you imagine, for a quite a small boy, that image of the sea. And once I discovered that Tennyson had also been up there and walked there, that became something very, very important to me. And
Mm.
one last connection.
Yeah,
Um,
beautiful.
the I got the chance to be a what's called a visiting fellow commoner at Trinity College, Cambridge. This is back in about 2000, I think. And I used to dine. I was allowed to dine with the Dons.
Mm.
I think there were 6 Nobel Prize winners on that dining hall. So it was an extraordinary experience, and mostly in the sciences. But just on the way in, waiting to go into hall with my gown on, there was a wonderful portrait, a very impressive man with quite short haircut, very bold face. And this was William Whewell.
Mm.
And I found out he became master of the college, but he was also young Tennyson's tutor. But Whewell was a great scientist. He
Mm.
wrote an inductive history of the sciences. And indeed, he actually invented the word scientist at a famous meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which was held at Cambridge. So this again struck me that, okay, Tennyson's first tutor wasn't so much a literary man as a science man. And this
Mm.
began to sort of redirect my thoughts about Tennyson. Those are 3 early connections.
No, that's fascinating. And maybe a little. different than some people might have suspected. And we can talk a little bit later about how Tennyson is also a kind of evolution, pun pun may be intended there,
Yeah.
from the Romantic period and from the sort of earlier period that you've written about so brilliantly. Um,
Yes, that's right. I mean, there was a sense, having written about Shelley and Coleridge and Keats and so on, there was a question, where did English poetry go next? And I, at the end of the book, I say that maybe we can look at Tennyson as the last of the Romantics, but also
mm,
the first of the moderns. And I describe what I mean by that. But that connection, that extension, was very important to me, and many of the themes from the Age of Wonder could then be developed in Tennyson's biography. Might be just worth saying, The Age of Wonder is a book with a whole lot of poets and scientists. I think 60 altogether, and it's a sort of panorama of that period,
yes.
the Romantic period, where the scientists and the poets are talking together, Coleridge and Humphrey Davy, the great chemist, and so on. But by contrast, the Tennyson book, I've just concentrated on one life, Tennyson's life, and it's through his process of education and reading and science is that we then see the next day in just pre Darwin. It's that
Pre-Darwin.
period, yeah.
But some of those same figures from Age of Wonder are either in the Tennyson book or being read by Tennyson, or even he's encountered some of them as well. I mean, there's a
Yes,
very natural continuation there, the Herschel and others.
absolutely. And he nearly met Wordsworth when he went up to the Lake District, but did not. Um, but he certainly read a lot of Shelley.
Mm,
Just to give you an idea of how one generation on, when he was at Cambridge, it was proposed that there should be a great debate of who was greatest, Shelley or Byron. Shelley belongs to Oxford, Byron belongs to Cambridge. So the students of Oxford and Cambridge then set to work, and they each spoke up for their own man, but also for the other side. So I say it was the first version of the Oxford and Cambridge boat race. It was like that. So that spirit of looking back at the Romantic generation was very important to Tennyson and his friends.
yeah, yeah, and very important to this book. And I would imagine part of the way you shape the book too is that kind of that sense of continuation. I mean, there were ruptures, and we should talk about those, but also a sense of very much that he was continuing this tradition. I mean,
Yeah, and very specific things like I think when he's 15, he hears the news that Byron has died out in Greece during the Greek War of Independence. And he goes alone down to there's a stream in a place called Hollywell, which is still there in the little village where he lived. And he carved the name Byron. Byron is
mm,
dead on a rock. And again, it's rather vivid. I think of a teenager, as it were, looking back at
mm,
the previous great writers and actually carving the name.
mm,
Coleridge, of course, carved his own name. That's another
mhm.
story earlier on.
But before we get into all that, we should start a little bit. Maybe you could just sketch for everyone what Tennyson's childhood and family life was.
Yeah,
As you said, it was not uncomplicated. And then after that, we can sort of talk a little bit about how Cambridge,
yeah,
what Cambridge meant to him.
yeah. So he was born in a little village called Somersby in Lincolnshire. His father was the local parish priest and rector. It was a large family, 11 children, basically. And it might have been, I think, quite a sort of lyrical upbringing. He was very fond of that area around called the Wolds, which is the sort of wild hillsides leading to the sea. And there are wonderful stories of him as a small child, getting up early to go and walk through the orchards and listen to the wind. And then he was also taught to use a telescope, I found, and a microscope very
Mm,
early as a kid.
mm,
And there's some he wrote early poems with included quite a lot of scientific notes. Specific thing is wonderful passage about the different shapes of eyes in animals.
Mm,
Okay, and a wonderful study of that in a quite sort of scientific way. And we, at the same time, we know he was reading um, a great conversation in physics and chemistry by woman writer Jane Marset.
mm,
So his beginnings was also quite scientific, but
mm, mm,
that family was what we would call pretty dysfunctional because his father, the parish priest, um, was actually an alcoholic,
mm,
and it got worse and worse as Tennyson grew up, and the father had terrible rages.
mm,
He attacked his eldest son Frederick with a knife. Extraordinary accounts of this. And there's some mysterious thing, it's almost like a Bronte life, is that the family cook somehow caught fire in the kitchen and burnt to death. So there's extraordinary sort of disturbed background that Tennyson has. And yet he's at the same time writing these poems and exactly observing um, natural life around him. So you get these two influences in his childhood. But I think going to Cambridge was a great escape for him because it got
mhm,
him out of this pretty terrifying, I think, household and suddenly into a new circle of friends. So that's a sort of basic thing. Just to, he was born 1809, which is actually the
yeah,
same year as Charles Darwin, just to situate that. And one of
mm,
what will become one of his great friends, who's very important in the book, called Edward Fitzgerald, but we'll talk about that.
yeah.
Um, so,
And so he arrives at Cambridge, and Cambridge at this time. I mean, it might be helpful to sketch him. He's coming from a kind of, I mean, a lot of the people at Cambridge are sort of wealthier and better educated
yeah,
than he is as well.
yes, that's
And so
right.
he go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he is what would call a provincial. He always talked with a Lincolnshire accent.
Mm.
And incidentally, he was an extremely good mimic. And one of the things we know about him that the first tutor I mentioned, William Whewell, was himself a Yorkshireman, and Tennyson could do a wonderful version of his Yorkshire accent, making large scientific statements, but in this Yorkshire accent, um, which again gives one a slightly different take on Tennyson. So he comes up there as the provincial, but he makes immediate impact. Partly, he looks so impressive. He's over 6 foot, with absolutely wonderful mane of hair and rather dark,
Mm,
what's described as slightly Spanish looks
mm,
and deep
mm,
eyes, and this amazing voice, which everybody describes, um, which is Lincolnshire, but it's deep. And it's somebody, his friend Edward Fitzgerald described it, it's like a wind blowing through a forest. Sort of
mm,
a wonderful
mm,
idea of power of it.
mm,
And he attracts a pretty immediate circle of friends, which are a great relief to him, I think, after the life at Somersby. He joins a society called the Apostles, which is a very sort of intellectual discussion. To get into it, you have to be pretty special. Um, and he makes a series of lifelong friends. The most notable, I suppose, early on is Arthur Hallam, who is
mhm,
not a provincial, his father is a historian, a member of the Royal Society, and he's grown up in London and he's gone to Eton, whereas Tennyson just went to local school, which he absolutely hated. So and yet this friendship um, immediately formed, and I think it sort of opens up Tennyson's whole world, that people he can really talk to. Um,
mm,
and that they write and exchange poems, and they talk a lot about the people like Shelley and
mm.
Coleridge. So
So,
that's
I mean, it sounds like a very classic in a way. You go to university, and your intellectual life opens. You make friends who are
exactly. Yes,
as intellectually stimulated as you are, and from
that's
there you
right.
kind of you blossom. Yeah.
And he and Arthur Hallam make 2 trips abroad. In fact, they go down through France and into Spain, uh,
Mm.
where a minor revolution is taking place, and they get really tangled into that. Um, and all the time, Tennyson is writing, goes in for what a prize. It's called the Chancellor's Medal in Cambridge, and he wins it with a poem called Timbuktu, extraordinary poem. Um, and he then becomes his work is known among the undergraduates, and as he writes poem, he circulates them,
Mm.
and that would include the Kraken poem and another rather important one called the Palace of Art, which is a lot about has a lot about astronomy, because he's now beginning to read the geologists and astronomers of that generation. We'll talk about that a lot. So that's a powerful sort of Cambridge formation. Um, um, but what is very distinctive about it is that Arthur Hallam, himself taken abroad by his father um, in 1833, suddenly dies. He has some kind of what's described as apoplectic fit, probably some kind of stroke. So,
Right.
age 22, he dies, and this is devastating to Tennyson, but also that whole circle. And another thing which I should have added into the story, that he would take Arthur Hallam back to visit the family at Somersby. The father, incidentally, had been sent abroad to recover from alcoholism. But Arthur Hallam enchants the other Tennyson siblings, and he falls in love with Tennyson's younger sister, Emily Tennyson. Um, and so there's this very interesting triangle forms the great friendship between Tennyson and Arthur Hallam and um, Emily Tennyson. So it's one of those sort of three-way friendships, I think. And so when Hallam dies suddenly, this is devastating to all of them, including Emily. They were, in fact, unofficially engaged and so on.
Mm.
So this has a tremendous emotional impact on Tennyson.
I mean, one way of looking at it is it seems to sort of rupture him for years, no, or maybe even for a decade or two. It sets him
Yes,
down a darker path.
the darker path, yes. And he begins to write a series of elegies. Um, the first one in October, in the same month that he gets news of Arthur Hallam's death. And these will be written, collected over really the next 15 or 17 years. And they become what would be his most famous poem, In Memoriam,
Right.
which is about 131 of these poems. And they begin at that time. And what I tried to show in the book is that they begin as intense mourning, um, almost like love poems,
Mm.
um, very emotional and powerful. But then they gradually draw in a whole lot of others. So the idea of death, Arthur Hallam's death, becomes then the general problem of mortality. And this
Mm.
begins to connect with his reading with the idea of extinction generally, which he's been reading at the same time Charles Lyell, the great geologist of that time, who, with his excavation of fossils and his new
Mm.
notion of how the Earth, the planet Earth, changed, um, brings the idea that a whole world of extinct creatures lie far, far behind us in the past. And this is very challenging to ordinary sort of uh, Christian theories at this point. And so Tennyson decides to confront that and bring that into his poem. So the elegies also become a sort of scientific epic. How can he
Mm.
face these
Mm.
erupting monsters of ideas, one being extinction?
and a kind of emotional, intellectual journey, right? So you sort of we can track his, and you do this brilliantly. Track his reading and the how his thinking about science and these ideas is changing over that period of time as well.
That's right. Um, and I've included, so the book includes some study of Charles Lyell, the geologist, actually, how he came to write his great work, The Principles of Geology, which had a terrific impact on the whole of Tennyson's generation, but particularly Tennyson getting this into his poetry. And we'll look at that. Perhaps I'd like to read you one of those in a moment.
But yeah, you should please.
He's at the same time he's studying the latest uh, s- works on astronomy, and particularly uh, William Herschel of the previous generation and John Herschel, um, who are great astronomers, and they absolutely changed the idea of as it were, the depth of the universe, how big it is, and how old it is, how totally different ideas of time and space are developed by those two. And again, um, Tennyson is reading their works and gradually putting it into his poetry.
And yeah, and those are, I mean, central figures in the Age of Wonder, your earlier book as well, the Herschel.
That's right. So there's a handing over there as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
this time I try and study the impact of these scientific changes um, in one person's imagination, Tennyson's imagination, and it's not so much the early ideas of evolution. It's the imaginative impact they have. This is the thing I'm so interested in. Um, so the early geology and extinction challenges a whole worldview, really. Um, and it also makes science uh, carry quite a threatening message. The
Mm,
idea that whole species would go, including mankind, Homo sapiens.
mm.
Um, and it's coming to face that question um, that gives a lot of the power to Tennyson's poetry in Memoriam.
Fascinating. And just to set the scene for people a little bit, these figures, Charles Lyell, I mean, and the Herschels and others that you
Yeah.
write about, Mary Somerville as well. I mean, their work was being received by a kind of general educated public too. It wasn't these weren't sort of this was they had a profound public impact as much as they had an impact on Tennyson as well.
Yes, that's right. It's a great first age of popular science writing, I think. You mentioned Mary Somerville, um, a very interesting Scottish mathematician who wrote a book that absolutely fascinated Tennyson called On the Connection of the Physical Sciences. And it was the first kind of panoramic book that goes through all the sciences and tries to link them, uh, particularly ideas of rhythm and repeated patterns. She writes about, she connects wonderful descriptions of the way light changes and water changes, and that wave movement is the same in water or in light, or in fields of wheat and corn when the
Mm,
wind blows through them. Wonderful evocations of that, which
mm,
again get into Tennyson's poems. But a lot of them record um, the kind of shock of this, continuing with the idea of the Kraken, that there's something almost monstrous in these ideas because they threaten a kind of what would become the Victorian worldview. And Tennyson registers that very, very powerfully.
what it seems that he sort of embodies that tension throughout, especially through the early life, right? And I guess that's part of the reason you found him such an interesting figure in this period.
Yes, that's right. I wonder if in the middle of the 131 poem sequence of In Memoriam, there's a poem with no title, it's simply number 56.
Mm,
I wonder if I could read that. Would that be
please.
be
Please, with pleasure.
helpful, I think. Um, so he refers to the notion of the type, which is a particular, a species in animals or indeed in plants, and the idea that these types could go extinct, and the way that threatens um, human society and particularly religious belief. So let me read this number in Memoriam, number 56. So careful of the type, but no, from scarped cliff and quarried stone, she cries, 1,000 types are gone. I care for nothing. All shall go. Thou makest thine appeal to me. I bring to life, I bring to death. The spirit does but mean the breath. I know no more. And shall he, man, her last work, who seemed so fair, such splendid purpose in his eyes, who rolled the psalm to wintry skies, who built him fanes of fruitless prayer, who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw with ravine, shrieked against his creed, who loved, who suffered countless ills, who battled for the true, the just, be blown about the desert dust, or sealed within the iron hills. No more? A monster then, a dream, a discord. Dragons of the prime that tear each other in their slime were mellow music matched with him. O life, as futile then as frail. O for thy voice to soothe and bless, what hope of answer or redress? Behind the veil, behind the veil. Now, that's
Magnificent. Thank you.
it's a magnificent, powerful poem, and of course, various images. The monsters, the dragons of the prime, of course, is a reference to the discoveries of dinosaurs and so on.
Mm,
But
mm,
above all, that extraordinary phrase, though nature red in tooth and claw was ravin, which has sort of gone down, it's sort of proverbial now. And one of the things I try to explain is the shock that little phrase must have had for the readers then in about 1850.
mm,
Now we're kind of used to it, but now we also know what it means. And it's not just nature, but it's mankind who is red in tooth and claw. So the poem has a particular kind of resonance, I think, for us. And I
mm,
try to
mm.
set some of that.
No, you do that brilliantly. And so you think, I mean, obviously in 1850 when this was published, the readers were primed, as it were, for his poetic understanding of this of what the science had been sort of teaching people or telling
Yes,
people.
I think they were, but he was exactly as Darwin. Remember, this is before Darwin. This poem is published in 1815, 1850, and Darwin, Origin of Species, is 1859. And it's remarkable that the sort of challenge of evolution and so on is shown already in this poem, but before Darwin is published. And I ought to add in another science book that which has been almost forgotten now, but was very powerfully shaping for Tennyson, was a book called The Vestiges of Creation.
Mm,
And this was again by a general science writer, Scottish man called Robert Chambers. And this put forward an early version of evolution throughout the physical material world. So beginning with star systems, but going right down to planetary life. Uh, and throughout, I mean, he's very interested in how evolution then has a moral effect. And there's a wonderful passage, one thing particularly I pick out on talking about evolution of kind of intellectual and emotional life. And there's a wonderful passage on the loyalty of dogs.
Mm,
which he
mm,
says evolves as a kind of a moral evolution that's going on in the animal species. It's
mm,
just a tiny moment, but in that same book about dogs, he's also writing about the solar system. So this has a huge effect on Tennyson, and I think that number 56, um, that poem, also reflects both the sort of anger and terror of that book, I think.
mm. Terror in the sense of the sort of how it's challenging Tennyson's beliefs and
That's
Christian
right.
view. Yeah.
And it's daring to write about that. The very first proof copies of that poem in Memoriam, he dropped that number 56. He didn't include it
Mm.
because he thought it might shock people too much. It is included in the first full edition. Um, and
So
then,
he added it back in. You're saying.
yes, he added it back in. And the thing I look at that he also wrote at the last moment extraordinary prologue, um, in which he kind of refutes all the scientific ideas. He goes back to a traditional religious comfort, and he puts that in the beginning of the poem, as if he's apologizing um, for the way this poem will develop in the prologue, and yet it
And this was
does.
yeah, and this was sort of done at the last minute, basically, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe just to give readers a sense, basically for what 17 years he's been writing all the poems that'll end up in Memoriam at various points, and then sort of, and a lot of them are challenging the you know Christian belief in various
Yes.
ways, championing these kind of new scientific ideas. But then suddenly, in the last year or even the last
Yes.
months, yeah,
I look at that. I mean, that's very. We haven't talked much about as it were, his emotional life. I mean, he after the death of Arthur Hallam, he has a series of sort of not quite affairs, but with uh, local women. There's a wonderful local beauty called Rosa Baring, who he writes poems to, and then there's a younger one called uh, Sophie Rawnsley. Um, who makes Tennyson dance. It's a great sort of scene. She, in his apparent depression illness, she makes him dance,
mm,
and he writes
mm,
poems to the best to all of them. And the third one is Emily Selwood, who he begins to court, but it takes 17 years for him to propose to her.
mm,
And she is a considerable figure in her own right. And he's sending her some of their poems, and he's worried that her much more traditional faith will be offended by these. And really, it's not until he sent her a finished copy of the In Memoriam, and she, as it were, approves it, that they go ahead and marry after that very, very long courtship. So that's a little tiny background to the writing of the poems, which are obviously go into much, much more detail. I found actually very recently somebody sent me a copy of a
mm,
diary kept by the Rawnsley family, um, and they knew Tennyson um, very well in the year before he gets married. And there's a
mm,
wonderful account where he's meeting Emily Selwood, and they're obviously arguing, and they're probably arguing about getting married.
mm,
And
mm,
it's not made specific, but it's a wonderful thing where she says, the diary writer says, Emily, by the end of the conversation, Emily was very red in the face, and
mm,
Tennyson looked grim. And
mm.
in a way, I found that it's sort of it's a
Not very
wonderful.
promising.
Yeah, no, well, the reverse actually.
Uh,
I think the reverse. I think, okay, yes, this was a passionate thing.
mm,
Anyway,
mm.
just a glimpse. I happened to see that very
That-
recently.
That's
But
interesting. No, that's fascinating. So, do you think? I mean, I guess thinking about his belief. I mean, it seems at some points that you surmise or think based on the work that he was kind of agnostic, perhaps is the right term. I'm not quite sure if we know quite what he
yes,
was.
Yes, I think agnostic, which is a word invented at this time, Victorian word really.
Mm,
Um, it was one of the, for example, another of the In Memoriam poems is a series of poems about Lazarus the,
mm,
and the resurrection of Lazarus. A wonderful account of that, um, where he ends up saying the evangelist gives us no explanation of this. So you're left
mm,
hovering. Is it a true miracle or is it something else? And that's
mm,
very
mm,
typical of Tennyson, the way yes, he hovers between belief and disbelief, between the skepticism of true science um, and the traditional views of religious belief. And it's remarkable that, I mean, nobody gets it into poetry in quite the same way as he does.
especially not in this period, right? I mean, no one else is kind of capturing that tension.
Yeah, just helpful to be a bit more specific.
Sure, please.
There is a much shorter poem from In Memoriam, um, and this accepts that here the way the earth has changed and evolved, um, and in a way he's struggling to accept what will be Darwinian theories, I think, and it begins the idea. There's the idea of the dark city street, which appears quite often in the poems,
Mm,
and in this one, the city street was something else earlier. So this is in Memoriam number 123. There rolls the deep where grew the tree. O earth, what changes hast thou seen? There where the long street roars has been the stillness of the central sea. The hills are shadows, and they flow from form to form, and nothing stands. They melt like mist, the solid lands, like clouds, they shape themselves and go. But in my spirit will I dwell and dream my dream and hold it true. For though my lips may breathe adieu, I cannot think the thing farewell.
mm,
So he's bidding adieu to the old religious beliefs, maybe, or something more personal. But he can't quite think it's really adieu. I cannot think the thing farewell. And that whole idea of the natural world changing and the hills and the cliffs and everything melting, it's a very, the idea of evolutionary change there and how you can, in a sense, rely on nothing in the material world. So it's
mm.
short, and that's a kind of agnostic poem, I think.
Yeah, very much so. So then, how do you
There,
understand then? Sorry, go
I was
ahead.
going to say, although Darwin hadn't published then in his travel books, his voyages, there is a description of a very similar scene where he comes across um, an area where there must have once been trees and so on, and then the sea has moved away, the central sea has moved out.
Mm,
So
mm.
those are images from directly from the scientists that go into the poems.
Fascinating. And I guess then, just to kind of conclude this thought on belief, then. So then, when he's writing then this sort of this new prologue, is that because he's changed his belief, you think, or because it's a simply because for a
Yeah,
romantic gesture, or somewhere bit of both, or
it's one of the. It, I did conclude. I mean, Tennyson is a mysterious figure.
mm,
And there are things that it's very difficult to know about him. And
mm,
one of the ways of looking at that prologue is that he just thought, um, if he prepared his reader by saying one could still have uh, religious beliefs, that somehow the poem wouldn't be attacked in the same way. There is a view that it also was partly addressed to Emily Selwood, his future wife, to kind of not exactly appease her, but to say that they weren't totally opposed in their beliefs, and he could accept in the prologue, and as it were, a traditional religious view. So it's complicated what that prologue is doing, and I look at it quite carefully in the book. Um, but the idea that I think Tennyson's very good at sort of leaving things suspended, uh, so both sides of the question are hovering there, I think.
Mm, mm, mm. Brilliant. Um, I mean, obviously, we've got there's lots in the life to discuss. I think it might be interesting for readers to understand a little bit, um, kind of taking Tennyson from that moment, 1850, he publishes in Memoriam. It's a huge sensation, right? Big
Yes,
best-selling.
it's quite extraordinary from that point of view. That poem sells 60,000 copies in the first
Mm,
year, 1850, and there'd been nothing like that. Um, of course, we're contemporary with the novels of, say, Dickens. All
mm,
right, but for a poet, that was quite extraordinary, I think. Um, and then suddenly, from being almost unknown, except for this small circle of friends, um, he becomes a national figure. And in the same year that he publishes In Memoriam, he gets married, and he's also made poet laureate, which is kind of the official poet of the nation.
right.
He has some doubts about this. So it's an extraordinary change from a kind of obscurity to a tremendous national celebrity. But it cost him certain things, I think. And I argue that the poetry after that it changes. He writes 12 volumes of an Arthurian epic called The Idylls of the King. And that's what we would now call Victoriana, in my view.
Mm,
It's
mm,
not grappling with these ideas in this same extraordinary, powerful way. I should add also um, that I introduced in the book another friend just after Cambridge called Edward Fitzgerald, who's a
mm,
great reader of Tennyson's poem and is a great supporter of Tennyson in the middle period, his obscure period. I mean, he suffers terrible periods of depression. He moves from Somersby to a village in Essex called High Beach, uh, where he tends, there's a sort of, not exactly a madhouse, but an asylum where one of his brothers, Septimus, is actually um, goes to live there. And Tennyson talks a lot to the asylum keeper, a man called William Allen. And the kind of voices of mad people go into a later poem called Maud, which is right at
mm,
the end of this period, 1855. Um, so um, that kind of uh, development after 1850 is rather strange because there is this inner life going on and the voices of the mad people. Incidentally, that Maud, it has an extraordinary series of images of being buried under the earth. And I
mm.
discovered that Tennyson read, um, um, how, uh, and just a little blank there, take you back. But it's Edgar Allan Poe's premature burial. It's a wonderful
Oh,
story.
yes, yes,
Uh,
yes.
and Tennyson was tremendously impressed by it, and it affects some of the imagery in Maud and the idea of buried, the buried lover. Um, and I think that a lot of Tennyson's sort of frustrations and unhappiness uh, comes out in that poem. But I was talking about Edward Fitzgerald, who's a great friend who supports him during his own struggles of this kind. And he becomes, in my book, a kind of Greek chorus because he's always
Mm,
there. He's
mm,
very different. He has a kind of down to earthness about him. And also, he, I mean, it's tragic in a way, it's comic tragic, is that when Tennyson becomes famous, Fitzgerald, the friendship just goes on the rocks because Fitzgerald hates this sort of surrounding of celebrity. And he
yeah.
also thinks that the early poetry is much better than the later, which I think is true.
Right.
And
Right.
he's quite critical, openly critical. So he keeps it's a kind of voice, as a, yes, a Greek chorus voice that I use because I think many modern readers would have the same kind of impatience that Fitzgerald has. And Fitzgerald expresses this very well, I think, though he remains tremendously loyal to Tennyson. So he's an important figure in the book. I should say,
Even
go on.
even
Yeah.
while Tennyson is sort of ignoring him, and
That's
I mean,
right.
there's this very painful period where for decades Tennyson's kind of not replying to his letters, or his wife's replying
That's
instead. And
right. Yes, that's
yeah,
right. Although I use this at the end of the book um, because Fitzgerald, in an extraordinary way, discovers Persian poetry and he translates it and he sends these
mm,
translations to Tennyson. And what
mm,
this becomes is the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, possibly the second most popular poem after In Memoriam in the Victorian period. So
sure,
there's extraordinary exchange between the two, um, despite the fact that the friendship has, they don't see each other until once right at the end of Fitzgerald's life. And it's a scene which I use to actually close down the book, but I'll leave that. Um, I think it's rather touching and takes them back to the sea.
very
Um,
moving. Yeah,
um, and it's a way of moving away from Tennyson's celebrity life, which I find quite difficult to deal with.
yeah. I mean, that goes to maybe about one of the sort of fundamental questions here is, why you chose to focus on the young Tennyson,
Yes,
largely, and I think in part of that's, I think, because the older Tennyson, the great celebrity, is someone that, I'd be curious for a, why you chosen the young one, but also b, it seems that at least the way I grew up understanding Tennyson, and I think most readers do, is that sort of the older, the Charge of the Light Brigade, these sort of great Victorian poems,
yes,
um, and I think the earlier stuff had become obscured and misunderstood, or even not even understood at all. I mean, obviously, In
yes,
Memoriam is read, but the kind of the earlier period before that is largely, I think, underappreciated until your
yes.
book.
Well, yes, and the later poems. I mean, they become half a league, half a league, half a league onwards into the valley of death, rode the 600. They're kind of, their sounds are with us, aren't they? Although actually I write about that poem because in its original form, it was actually not a sort of celebration poem. It was a protest poem,
Mm, mm,
uh, rather like in the World War One, sort of objecting to the way the generals expended their troops. It's a poem protest at the useless waste of life. Um,
mhm,
and he sends it not to the Times, but to the Guardian, which was an opposition paper really at the time.
mhm.
So even there's a different way of looking at things. There's one other element there, how that he was very worried whether this marriage would work, and it did work. Um, but there's a sort of key moment, which again, I just if I can find this for you. Um, uh, yeah, again, I hope you don't mind me reading, but it seems to me the poems are what we're really
I love
concentrating
this. No,
on.
this is
Yeah.
fantastic, and everyone, all
Okay.
the readers.
So this is poem he wrote at the second year of their marriage, 1851, and it's quite different from what people might think of as a Tennysonian poem. And it's about his firstborn child who was actually um, miscarried and
Mm,
never
mm,
lived. Um, and in fact, it had an extraordinary effect on Tennyson that it sort of broke his heart in a way that he didn't expect at all. And after that, this tragedy of the firstborn child, paradoxically, the marriage seems to be much more of a success. He has two sons. Um,
mm.
Um, and so it sort of shifts his whole sensibility, I think. But anyways, let me just read this because it's almost unknown and it's a different kind of Tennysonian poem, although you'll see it has certain echoes. On my firstborn child. Little bosom not yet cold, noble forehead made for thought, little hands of mighty mould, clenched as in the fight which they had fought. He had done battle to be born, but some brute force of nature had prevailed, and the little warrior failed. Whate'er thou wert, whate'er thou art, whose life were as ended ere thy breast begun, thou 9 months' neighbour of my dear one's heart, and howsoe'er thou liest blind and mute, thou lookest bold and resolute. God bless thee, dearest son. So it's a broken
Mm,
poem that some of the rhymes don't
mm,
work, some of the rhythms don't work. It seems to me tremendously moving, and I connect it in a way. We go right back um, to the Kraken, um, because this is, as it were, a sort of blessed Kraken child who also never
mm,
quite makes it,
mm.
but it does in a sort of paradoxical way. It sort of blesses Tennyson's and Emily's marriage, and it will be a great success after this. This is
Mm.
this kind of grief. So the grieving is displaced, and it makes way for his for the next two children and a much happier life, I think.
Extraordinary. Yeah, that moment of transformation. It's a beautiful poem. I never heard it before until reading your book.
Yes, it's almost unknown. As I say, it's like it's sketch because the rhythms are broken, but the vivid idea of the child is seen, the little warrior.
Oh yeah, incredibly moving.
Yeah, yeah,
Incredibly moving. I don't want to. We're going to wrap up soon here, but I just had one or two
yeah,
more thoughts for you. Questions. One, I was curious a little bit about how your views of Tennyson changed from while writing this book. I mean, I think you've written brilliantly about this before, but how the what as a biographer, one's own emotional and intellectual engagement, uh, it shapes obviously the book you write, but also kind of can change as you spend time with a subject
yeah.
and you walk in their footsteps across manuscripts and all that. So I'm curious sort of how you think differently about Tennyson today than you did when you maybe started the book.
Yeah, it's true. And there's a sense in which you never know your subject until you actually write about them. However much
Mm,
you research it, it's the activity of writing that really brings you in relationship. As I say, that I had a probably quite a sort of childlike view of Tennyson. First, I described my trips up to his when I was whatever it was, 12 or 11 or 12 or so, and that idea of Tennyson and the beach and the poetry, all the monsters coming out of the sea, um, was very powerful for me. Um, but then, as I read on, and I found the terrible disruption in the family, and then the unhappiness surrounding Arthur Hallam's death, um, I've I've realized that there was a kind of depth to Tennyson that I hadn't really
mm,
registered at all. And also, having his friend Fitzgerald, the critical friend, was
hmm
tremendous help to me because Fitzgerald has it is he's almost a biographer there in
mm,
the way he writes
mm,
about his friend, and I think the that image of the friend of someone who then becomes very famous, and that's that's quite a powerful general thing. We all know in our lives, friends of people who the friendship drops away, but it's been very
sure.
important. I
Mm,
think that's almost a universal phenomenon. So that fascinated me. Um, and then I think the idea was extraordinary that the way that Tennyson writes so much about the imaginative impact of science before Darwin, who was born in exactly the same year as Tennyson, 1809, and also was at Cambridge and so on. They didn't
mm,
know each other there. Um, but he's writing a huge prologue, a poetic prologue to Darwin in many ways.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and I found that rather enthralling, really. And it seemed to me the kind of struggle he was having with sciences. it kind of mirrors the sort of struggles we have now to register, for instance, our devastating effect on our environment and the
Mm,
extinction of
mm,
animal species and so on now, and registering what's happening in climate change and what
sure.
this means and how far we can believe it. Um, all that has great resonance, I think. Um,
Mm,
but I think finally I feel the scene at the end where Tennyson says goodbye, in fact, to Edward Fitzgerald. I'm left with this idea that what a mysterious character Tennyson was in many ways. Um,
mm.
and that's sort of also rather inspiring. And I've always had this thing with biography, however hard you work to tell the truth, in the end, the truth escapes you. It escapes.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh,
No, I think that's very. And did you feel like with Tennyson that he was a more elusive figure than Shelley or Coleridge, say? Or
um, Very different in some ways, yes. Because you can, I mean, for example, with Courage, I had the wonderful thing of the notebooks, the personal
yes. Yeah.
30 years of personal notebooks, and which takes you right into his heart in an extraordinary way. And Tennyson, no, the letters reveal a certain amount of revealing, but there's nothing like Coleridge diaries. Um,
Mm,
but the poetry is revealing of his intellectual and uh, emotional struggles, I think, very
mm,
much. So it
mm,
was a different way of working as a biographer.
mm.
And that's each subject always presents its own challenges.
Yes, they each demand something different from you.
Yeah, they do. And also the shape of, I mean, that decision to stop the book really after Tennyson was whatever it was, 42, 43, um, was a very deliberate thing that
Mm,
I didn't want to, as it were, blur the overview of Tennyson's life by this decade and decades of Arthurian work and celebrity and so on. I wanted to keep it that the really intense form of his life, and I think one can understand him better from that point of view. Um, and there was, I mean, there's a lot of still, I think, attitudes of that he is just a piece of Victorian. Who was it? Was it?
mm.
I forget. Was it James Joyce who called him um, Alfred Lawn Tennyson? Lawn, sort of through and through. So I wanted to avoid the lawn element and keep to, as it were, jungle Tennyson.
You have magnificently, Richard. Congratulations again on this brilliant book. The book again is The Boundless Deep. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Richard, for a brilliant conversation. And we're all so grateful to you for this book. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it. Tennyson before the beard. There we are.
Perfect. Thank you all. Have a good night. Thank you.